Hello, everyone. This is Michael. ASMR. A bit of a different video today. Um, I am in the middle of a PhD. Part of that PhD requires that you get a certain amount of credits. To get credits, you do modules. One of the modules that I selected was to talk or present my research in public. And then I write a couple of reflective pieces about it, at least 1,000 words each. Um, and so I thought, along with making a couple of posts on social media, that I would make a video where I talk about this. Um, in terms of ASMR, because this is ASMR channel, hopefully this works just as some kind of a rambly video, fairly soft-spoken slash whispering video that could just wash over you as white noise. Hopefully you just enjoy that. When I am writing my thesis, I will just put some ASMR on in the background, sometimes just some rambles, and I barely even know what they're talking about. And it just sort of helps the time pass and helps the focus somehow. Um, so either that, or maybe you'll enjoy some of the content of my research, because I think it can be a fairly worthwhile topic that I'm delving into. Well, either way, here's a bit of extra content for you, and this will help me with my PhD as well. Right, so the topic that I've been studying, researching, and I've been writing about now for quite some time um, is the English journalist, adventurer, writer George Orwell and his ideas of totalitarianism and how they are reflected, how they were reflected in the Cold War period. Now, why that's interesting, I think, is that most of the reactions to Orwell, who you have probably heard of, real name Eric Blair, um, is are in terms of owning the man, owning the name. You might have heard of Orwellian, 1984, some of the famous terms, thought crime, down the memory hole, ungood, etc., etc. And yet not as much attention has been placed on his actual ideas and their relevance and significance, at least in terms of analysing them, hopefully objectively. And because a lot of the focus has been on trying to sort of own Orwell politically and say which societies he really applied to or was applicable to in terms of the analysis. But from my research and understanding and my own analysis has led me to believe that his ideas really, in some ways, shaped, but mostly were reflected in the Cold War period across the political spectrum, across the social spectrum, across both sides of the Cold War. You might, if you are sort of aware of, say, Animal Farm, you might know that that mostly satirizes the first half of the 20th century in Russia with everything that happened there, and the whole Stalin period, especially the revolutionary Bolshevik era, and then all through the Stalin, or everything that happened there. We don't need to go too much into that, but I'm sure you understand what happened there roughly, and that's what Animal Farm delved into. So a lot of people will see Orwell and will then see that side of the Cold War, that side of things, the Soviet side of things, the USSR. But you can also notice plenty on the US side of things, on the West side of things. Both sides of the Cold War, the more you delve into it, really apply for these ideas to do with totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, what's the point of that? What's the function of that? Is it even a relevant term? These are debated aspects. Much like anything, though, if you say that, say, totalitarianism has never actually been realized, so it doesn't apply, or maybe it's a bit too hazy, how could we apply this? My counter to that would be, when have we ever truly had anything, whether it be communism, capitalism, democracy, authoritarianism? We Every instance of these political or social structures, uh, whenever they've been tried, they're always different, always flawed, um, and not often done to the nth degree, if you know what I mean. They haven't been enacted to the fullest extent of themselves. So, in terms of totalitarianism, has any country, including in the 1930s, 1940s, been entirely owned? In terms of, have all the citizens been owned? Were they owned by Hitler? Were they owned by Stalin? Were they even owned in Orwell's fiction? No. And that's the point. Even in 1984, which originally was going to be titled The Last Man in Europe for the protagonist Winston Smith, um, as you might remember, in that there's also a woman in it. But also in the prison in 1984, you get all kinds of other prisoners, other people who have, in one way or another, have moved against the system. So even The Last Man in Europe is satirical. And that's one of the things to understand about Orwell. Plenty of satire, sort of satire on top of satire. So you have the validity of totalitarianism, just how total is it? That's why some people are turned off by that term, I believe, because when has it ever been achieved that all minds have been owned? Never. Like I referenced with the two real-life examples, there were the churches, there were instances of the military, and all kinds of people who at no point voted for the Nazis, at no point even really knew all that much about Stalin. It might seem hard to believe in the 21st century, but a lot of people in Russia weren't even all that aware of what he looked like. The peasantry, who he brutally went after, were living their lives out in the country, not really knowing what's going on. And one of the benefits of that, of being, as Orwell would say, a prole, the proletariat, is not actually being owned by this totalitarian regime or the state. So Orwell, one of his lessons in 1984, as backed by a lot of his non-fiction writing, and the majority of Orwell's work was non-fiction. Peter Davison's work, the collected work of Orwell, spanned 20 volumes, and the second half were the volumes 10 to 20 were his letters, articles, diary entries. He didn't include most of his diary entries they are found elsewhere. He had war broadcasts. Orwell worked for the BBC for a while in the Indian section, because he was actually born in India, and soon came over to England. I'm going to make a point. I forgot what that specific point was. But on the validity of totalitarianism, it's not that it absolutely gets, it's literally enacted in terms of the totality aspect of it. That's more of the early Italian conceptions of the idea of everybody entirely being owned. That doesn't have to absolutely be the case for something to be totalitarian in essence. And that's the crux of my research in terms of, you can look at the Cold War and say, comparatively, the people weren't as owned, their consciousness was not as limited, they weren't quite as fanatical, all the people in society, from the elites to the proles to everyone in society, weren't as owned, weren't as affected, but they were still significantly affected. They were still shaped by their society to have perspectives of the other, the foreign counterparts, but also of their own society. So you'd have all kinds of Americans who would say go against the US. You'd have all kinds of dissidents and people moving against the state and heretics, if you like, in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, meaning the other nations surrounding Russia. So totalitarianism doesn't have to equal total, but I would argue that the important aspect of including totalitarianism as a term that's applicable is that authoritarian is more of a brutal clampdown. It's more about structuring and controlling, whereas totalitarianism is actually often more subtle than that, but as Orwell delved into, is more dangerous in a lot of ways. You can have a brutal regime, as we've seen for thousands of years, go back as far as you like. Um, you'll find authoritarian, despotic, tyrannical regimes. For a while, ancient Greece had, I believe, they had 30 tyrants. There's a famous 30 tyrant period, including in the era of Socrates. And you'll find these all around the world. So what's the difference between them? The difference of the modern era that developed over time is that the increased, if you like, scientification of it, the increased methodology, the capabilities, technology, many more people. And with more people, you can have more ideas against the regime, against the system. But you also have a lot of people to enact the system, to control it. A lot of members of the military, a lot of members of the, if you like, the thought police, sort of, or just the police, as we might call them now. We see in our own time, in some instances of cancellations, of policing thought, policing opinions. So whilst my research is mostly focused on the Cold War era, one of the significant elements of delving into Orwell at all is that the issues did not die with him in 1950 from an early age due to tuberculosis. These issues continue in the present day right now. These issues of totalitarianism did not go away. If anything, they're only increasing, which doesn't have to always mean that they're all necessarily always detrimental. There can be beneficial aspects of centralization, things like a national curriculum, healthcare services, some aspects of some charitable causes. You can have a lot of benefits with that, which you may term to be totalitarian. Karl Popper judged Plato as the first promoter of totalitarianism, and he was around 2,500 years ago. Plato / Socrates basically argued for the city-state, and in the Republic, which I have read, he was just promoting the city and people fitting into different roles. Is that totalitarian? Is that leading on to it? According to the philosopher Karl Popper, yes. And then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in essence led to revolutions. If you can have revolutions, then you can create a work like Animal Farm from Orwell that then would satirize the revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, which then would give rise to a lot of violence, a lot of upheaval, but also potential, because that's one of the points of Animal Farm, in that it's only when revolutions go bad that they are necessarily detrimental. Orwell was not against revolutions, absolutely, but he noticed when they could go wrong. He even said that there's a specific point in Animal Farm where the animals who are happy with the revolution, they opt for the easy way of the milk and apples, I believe, rather than staying the course. They opted for the seductive elements that the overlord pigs were offering them. And had they gone to Orwell, had they just stayed the course and kept their eyes on the promises the pigs had initially laid out for them, the revolution and the new system might actually have worked, because in the early stages, the animals were said to be really happy with their overthrow of the previously owned capitalist human manor farm regime. They were said to be happy, but it went awry. And that's the great lesson of Animal Farm, is that there's a great tendency of, if you like, the horseshoe effect you might have heard of the extremes equaling some great similarities. And so you can have, in the real world, you can have the Nazism and the Stalinism, the USSR, Soviet Union, ended up being great enemies. But what isn't too known is that they had a great pact before the Second World War. They were friends, they were allies, which Hitler broke. But again, the main point is that these different regimes, these different systems can in essence be quite similar. And that's what the main essence of Orwell's analysis on totalitarianism. Look out for the universal elements of totalitarianism. Whereas you'll have someone like Hannah Arendt, who's probably the most famous name in the space of totalitarianism, very well developed with the origins of totalitarianism. Most of her analysis seemed to center around the Nazis and the Soviets, But for Orwell, he wanted to enlighten people that this could happen anywhere. That's specifically why he wrote 1984, why he set, if you know the book, I recommend reading it if you haven't, why he set the book in a future England. He kept the name of London, but he switched the country of England to Airstrip 1. In this superstate of Oceania. There were three great superstates: Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia, and then the other sort of outer layers of the rest of the world weren't really dealt with very much anymore. And this would, in essence, really be similar to the future of the Cold War in a lot of ways. Of these superpowers in the real world, there were superstates in 1984, and their huge rivalry, the great threat of nuclear war. You might have heard of MAD, mutually assured destruction, the threat there in the 1960s. This overall threat being the greater issue rather than the actual atomic war, even though to the likes of Orwell in the 1940s, people, they were seriously considering that atomic war might actually happen. So it wasn't just a device. They were worried that this could happen in the future. But again, that's just one aspect of it. The main focus that I've sort of narrowed things down of Orwell's analysis is that he focused on aspects of manipulation, or the explicit efforts to change the mind, change the consciousness, the limits of the consciousness, change the conscience, ideas of morality. So the state actively influences and changes the way you behave, the way you see things, change the words, the terminology that you use. 1984 was famous for its slogans, sort of, in essence, going along with the same sort of slogans that you would find in the Second World War. And from these regimes, things like freedom is slavery, like he inverted a lot of things. War is peace, peace is war. So you had the significant slogans and language manipulation. There's a whole section in 1984 on Newspeak. It's the appendix at the end of the book, which complements a long middle section on it was Goldstein's book that was really looking into language manipulation. Orwell was very big on language manipulation. He had his Politics in the English Language article, which is excellent, very long non-fiction piece that delved into all of the different methods the regime, the system, totalitarian regime can look to use to own our minds, to affect the way that we think and see things. So even things that we just take for granted, the words that we use, in the language that we use, in the way that we speak, all shaped and manipulated really by society. Again, there can be beneficial aspects of that. We need to communicate after all. But certainly his big lesson was to look out for how that can go awry. Then you've got things like subversion, a little more subtle, I would argue even more powerful, in that it's not even the explicit manipulation of you, it's just things set up in society. Just everyday norms, everyday ways of going about things, the homes that people live in, like Winston Smith, the protagonist in 1984, anti-hero anyway, lived in the Victory mansions. He drank Victory gin. Everything was just victory, victory, victory. Even though he didn't have many successes, but it was supposed to be this idea of you've got to focus on the wins all the time. You're going to be aggressively competitive. Everything's got to be a victory. Even though he wasn't living in great conditions, everything Orwellian is this back to front way of looking at things, so that's the main satire that you get from Orwell, and I think he is popularly known for is inverting reality, and that was his main device to do it. But yeah, subversion in films, TV, things that just wash over people. They don't even realize what's going on. They had strict enforcements of exercise regimes in 1984, things that you just wouldn't even think. You might think you're completely in control of yourself, but the regime is actually just setting things up to shape your consciousness. Then there was coercion. That's the stronger effort to control you. So setting in place things that you must do. If you don't perform in certain ways, in 1984 there was things like face crime. If you pull the wrong faces, if you spoke in the wrong way, if you're acting against the system, then the system could arrest you, could get hold of you. 1984 has the famous torture section, culminating in Room 101. Again, one big effort of satire from Orwell to show just how severely the totalitarian regime can take any breaking of its structures. But he also, as he said in a letter to his friend Julian Simmons, wrote that section of explicit torture, of coercion, as I put it, to shock the reader, shock the audience, shock you and me into noticing what's going on. It's all well and good to have focus on manipulation, language, etc., culture. But unless you're properly emotionally invested, for Orwell, you weren't going to make a difference. And Orwell was a utilitarian. He wanted to make a difference in society. He allowed parts of the Soviet bloc, places like Ukraine, to spread his book for free. He didn't charge them. He was actively involved in the publishing and publication and translations of his work. He really wanted to make a difference. It's just debatable of what the lessons were from his work. And this is why I'm now delving into it, in that I think his work should be viewed in a universal way across all of society, in the Cold War and with the great implications beyond the Cold War. The final part of the sort of the four elements that I've broken Orwell down into is the hypocritical aspects, the theme of hypocrisy. In 1984, again, if you've read it, there's this term called double think, where people can hold contradictory elements in their brain at the same time, and it works. It's okay for them. They can actively go against sense. The antagonist of 1984, O'Brien, the torturer of Winston, an elite inner party member of the totalitarian state. He talks about doublethink. He talks about the reasoning behind it, really, and that they're testing people. They're creating the new consciousness, and then they test you through creating that. So in societies, how does that work in the real world? Say in the Cold War, if you might think that you're going for justice and fairness, how far does that extend? If you value someone's life, for example, is that extending beyond your society, outside of your front door? How far are you going with it? You say that you value science. How much are you sticking with science? Like things like that. It's the great test then of the society through that overall theme of hypocrisy. Because otherwise, as Winston and Julia said, they might make us confess. When we get into these, as they were both being arrested, or before they were both arrested, they were both speculating about, if we ever are arrested, what should we do? And they were both saying, we'll confess. It's fine. We'll confess. No problem. We know that we'll still love each other. But they were ultimately broken, especially Winston, who took much longer to be broken, according to O'Brien, who could have been lying, in that he gave up objective reality. He was eventually giving it up. It's interpreted that he sort of saved his own life, really, at the end, when he was met with his biggest phobia. His rats were his main phobia. And the party, the totalitarian regime, knew about it because they knew about their party members, and because Winston was an outer party member, so a less significant member of the Big Brother of the regime. So they knew plenty about him, so they could exploit his weaknesses. But so he moved against that phobia when they were threatening to have the rats eat his face towards the end. He gave up his love of Julia in favor of a love of Big Brother. I said, okay, stop, do it to Julia. Towards the end of the book, spoiler. And so now Winston loved the regime. He loved Big Brother. He'd given up his romantic love, as flawed as their relationship was, by the way. But the theme of hypocrisy, as I was talking about, it like they can say certain things, but the regime, they can confess, but the regime's not happy with that. The regime, as O'Brien said, wanted to get inside your mind, wanted to own your mind. Therein lies that crucial fundamental difference of totalitarianism with authoritarianism, where it's really looking to affect the mind, rather than just whatever you might say. Because Winston spent a lot of the time in the torture saying to O'Brien, what do you want me to say? Like, I'll say, yeah, okay, I love this Big Brother, I love this, I'm fine, I'll do whatever. But Big Brother wasn't happy. O'Brien wasn't happy with that. He wanted authentic ownership of his mind. He wanted to truly own him. It was intolerable, as they said, for anyone to have a thought against the system or the regime, with the caveat being that the proles, most of the proles, were deemed, the regular people, the masses of the population, which is like 80% of people, were deemed to not be worthwhile. Hence why Orwell wrote that the hope might actually lie in the proles rather than in the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia, the intellectuals, had created this system. They would come up with things like doublethink, where they would test you to see if you would do away with objective reality. Whereas the proles, for all of their limitations, flaws, would be actually less likely to deny objective reality. They would be likelier to say that 1 + 1 does equal 2. 2 times 2 equals 4. And so that was a very worthwhile sort of topic, aspect of totalitarianism that Orwell really delved into. Others didn't delve into as much, especially from a universal perspective. And that Orwell, that's why he had his final book, ended up being his final book. He was planning other books set in the future, because it's 1984. What's the significance of the year 1984? Nothing really. All the research into it, there's no particular evidence that there was any specific reason behind that date. The date was mentioned in Jack London's The Iron Heel, which is also a great other work of dystopian fiction that influenced Orwell. Jonathan Swift, Evgeny Zamyatin, H.G. Wells, some of these other great dystopian writers all influenced Orwell. Aldous Huxley with his Brave New World, all great influences on Orwell. But he featured 1984 because it was the future. Orwell didn't want to just focus on the 1940s, Second World War. He wanted to look at the future, what might be happening in the future. Set it in England, his big thing. Like I said earlier, he wanted everybody in the whole world to imagine that totalitarianism could happen anywhere. That the English-speaking races, as he said, weren't particularly above having a totalitarian regime here. You know, it's not just somewhere for Italy and Germany, or these days China or wherever. This could happen anywhere. And the long Cold War period, as I've been studying from the technically from the late 40s, but the 1950s through to the late 1980s, had all manner of these totalitarian aspects of the topic of the themes that I mentioned, the 4 themes that I mentioned, all kinds of subversion going on, manipulation, coercion, hypocrisies on show. You get all kinds of hypocritical elements of the Western aspects of promoting freedom and openness, and yet that they would close down debates and there would be arrests, cancellations, significant severe control in schools and institutions of people. And then you've got the supposedly virtuous Eastern side of things, the Soviets. They're morally superior to the West. They're always going to be ahead of them. And yet somewhat suffering and somewhat behind in things like the arms race and the space race, and science actually being behind the US in a lot of ways. And of course, with all their many dissidents, many instances of arrests and oppression of their people. So you've got all kinds of aspects of hypocrisy going on. including the interesting elements of these summits. You've got the summits between the two great powers through the Cold War. They're against each other, they're against each other, they're against each other. But then they just meet up every now and they have a lovely summit and they're all best friends, which is a bit like, if that rings a bell for you, it's a bit like Animal Farm at the end, where the pigs and the humans, the enemies of each other, they meet up and they show their similarities. They don't show that they're exactly the same. They still argued. It's a point Orwell made when he saw that people were misinterpreting Animal Farm. He said that they are still hostile to each other. Like in the Cold War, the sides were hostile to each other. But on occasion, they could have a summit, they could get together and show that they were the powerful ones. And this is the point, like Orwell had with his Orwell and the atom bomb. There's the superpower essence that's 1984 Orwell, and obviously the Cold War featured, where they're in control. It's not too much that they're trying to actually destroy each other. There's an even greater totalitarianism there, if you will. There's the more localized totalitarianism of each country, but then you've got the blocks, you've got the powers, the superpowers, and in essence, their organized structuring of each other. It's not some grand, you know, Freemasons conspiracy or whatever, but it's just the reality that they've moved themselves by necessity, quite frankly, into this structure of organization. And that's what Orwell was really focusing on. That's the point that he wanted to enlighten, especially with 1984, but in all kinds of his stories. He said, I think around 1936, every line I've written from here has been against totalitarianism. He was against totalitarian. That was the main function of Orwell, not the political sides or this or that or any of the other topics they might want to delve into that most commentators of Orwell have sought to take for their own. They've sought to take Orwell for their own. From Raymond Williams and Isaac Deutscher to Norman Podhoretz, Christopher Hitchens, all learned great men, but were in essence taking Orwell for their own political or personal ambitions. Whereas the main focus, I believe, and the point of my 100,000 words in my thesis is to look at his ideas with totalitarianism. He went beyond Hannah Arendt's focus on the Nazis and the Soviets, beyond Brzezinski and Friedrich, the Americans, who were using it as a stick to bash the Soviets with, beyond more recent versions even than of Simona Forti, Matthias Demet, looking at the sort of the psychological aspects of totalitarianism, very important and worthwhile. But Orwell focused on sort of all aspects of especially things like subversion. The psychological aspects tend to look at the manipulative elements, which again, like I said, is covered by Orwell. And Aldous Huxley looked at the hedonistic elements, covered by Orwell. But Orwell wanted to focus on the universal power elements enacted by the different topics that I've covered and all kinds of different expressions that I won't go into here, but I will write about by way of all of his different works. He wrote a few novels, but 1984 especially is really sort of his greatest, fullest delving into the topic of totalitarianism, especially in relation to the Cold War, because he got a lot of the essence of it about right. That's why Orwell has survived. Some people like Irving Howe really promoted Orwell. The CIA promoted Animal Farm in particular, because Animal Farm was a bit more against the Soviets, whereas Russia at least, 1984 can include the West. And that's what I've sought to do with my research, is look at totalitarianism as it includes across humanity, everyone. And hopefully that is a topic that's worth delving into, especially as you can see so much that's going on now that includes those different elements, from subversion up to aspects of coercion. And if things don't seem to make sense, if it seems to be contradictory, that topic of hypocrisy has been known for quite some time as well, especially by Orwell. So don't discount that if it seems to not make sense. There might be some purposeful reason why it's not making sense. It's to challenge people. It's to see if their consciousness has been affected enough. Anyway, there's so much more that could be said. I've talked much longer than I thought I was going to. Hopefully, in terms of the ASMR aspects of this, you've enjoyed a bit of a soft-spoken ramble in the background of whatever it is you're doing. And I'll look to make some more content soon as I get back to writing my theme, writing my thesis. Anyway, it's a very interesting topic. I think worthwhile topic, because it's a shame how I would say he was a great thinker, in George Orwell, people like that, if their message can sort of get lost over time or distorted. Like even towards the end of his life, when he was on his deathbed, he was noticing that people were starting to misinterpret 1984. He was quite clear that he said that this is applying across society. This is not just an attack on any one particular political persuasion or one nation or for one era. Nor was it a specific prophecy. He did say that this is a warning. This is not exactly what's going to happen. This is a book. This is a novel. This is a satire. But be wary of some of these essential themes. And that's what you get in the Cold War. That's what you get now. Was it exactly the same as everything that happened in 1984? No. Look out for the essential themes. Look out for the subversion. It's all around. If you notice it in films, TV, adverts, education, institutions, politics, media, everywhere you go, the language you use, whatever seems to go viral these days, look out for subversion as part of that totalitarianism or whatever term you would prefer to use, in terms of the centralized system affecting the way that we see things and affecting our own lives. Because that was one of the major themes as well from Orwell. However much you think you might be in control, how much are you in control? How much are you actually just saying the words, living the life that the society has set out for you? And that might be a good thing in some ways, but just how in control are you? How much have you already been subverted and manipulated? Have you found yourself saying contradictory things? That might be a bit of a clue. If there's a bit of a battle in your own mind, you might want to simplify some of that. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there. Nearly 40 minutes. But yes, this will help out with my thesis. Thank you very much for watching. I will make some more videos soon. It will be much shorter and more tingly than this, but here's a bit of a rambly video for you to enjoy. Thank you very much, guys.